A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby on a Monday, looking at the political agenda for the week ahead. Well, Michelle Pearse is the CEO of the Australian Christian Lobby. Michelle, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil, for having me. It's great to be here.
Michelle, let's start with the huge change that's happened on the weekend. The Northern Territory election, a landslide victory for the country Liberal Party, and the ACL's been working very hard in the Territory. Give us your impression.
Yes, we certainly do congratulate the new Country Liberal Party government. For the sake of Christian freedoms, it's a win, and we're seeing religious freedom being attacked all over the nation, and certainly in Northern Territory this was the case with their Anti-Discrimination Act, which limited the freedoms of Christian schools to hire according to their Christian ethos, which was a change that was introduced by Labor. So our Northern Territory Director there, Nicholas Lay, with other faith leaders as well, sought a commitment from CLP that they would repeal these changes. In fact, they said that they would, and so we were really hoping that they would win so that they could then repeal these changes. And we also spoke to the CLP about protections for the human rights of babies that survive abortions, and this has been big news in the past week as well. They also committed that they would support a bill to protect babies who survive abortion, so we'll certainly be following up on that as well. So you know, we're glad that it's moved this direction, and we're hoping that other Labor governments around the nation would wake up really and see especially the effect that Christians have on election outcomes and the way that we are concerned about our freedoms.
You know, special honour, I guess, here, due to your ACL leader on the ground in the Territory, Nicholas Lay. You mentioned Nicholas, and we had Nicholas as a guest on Friday as we were talking about a preview to what was coming with the Northern Territory election. And what a breath of fresh air to hear that he has been working so hard in the Territory and had commitments from people who were on the CLP side to repeal those changes of things that are just abhorrent as some of the laws that have been in place. This is a breath of fresh air, but this is what the ACL does. Just a pause for a moment here, because a lot of people might be thinking, what is the ACL doing? But these sorts of commitments are an important part of your work, Michelle.
Absolutely. It's so important that we have state directors on the ground having these conversations in the state that they live in. And Nicholas Lay's only come on just recently, and he's in the papers almost every week. He's on the radio. He's meeting with politicians. He doesn't work full time, and he's got a young family, and he does this quite sacrificially. He was out all weekend handing out flyers, letterbox dropping at the election booths. So he is so committed, and we can just see, you know, God's favour on this outcome. And we're really proud of Nicholas and all our state directors, in fact, and it does go to show the effect that on the ground lobbying does have on outcomes and really for our freedoms.
And, you know, repeal, I mean, this is, I think, is going to be an important word. We are in an election season, and some of the laws are so abhorrent that are in place in our states and territories that this word repeal is going to be an important part of where oppositions need to be very conscious. But repealing those amendments to protect faith-based schools, you mentioned that briefly, and repealing those things that have been around the babies born alive, these sorts of promises. Now that I guess the work begins to make sure that the CLP keeps those promises. So it's not a huge win yet, but if they hold firm to their promises, there can be wonderful outcomes in the Northern Territory.
That's right, and this is what we're going to do in the lead up to every election and the federal election as well, is repealing the damage that Labor have done in introducing anti-discrimination laws that don't in fact limit discrimination, but they enhance the discrimination against Christians. And this is a common thread throughout legislations through every state, and so there is a lot of undoing to be done, and a lot of commitments that we need to gain from the oppositions in order to restore what's been lost during the past era.
I note too that Nicholas Lay, your guy on the ground in the Northern Territory, he has commended the CLP for their boldness. And it seems to be that the CLP in the Territory might be leading the way with getting a little bit bold, because there's a certain timidity On the conservative side of politics, people not ready to make the sorts of bold promises to repeal. I wonder if there's a message in there for other campaigning oppositions with more elections ahead.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we certainly hope that this will embolden the Conservative side of the Liberal Party and even the Conservative factions or the more right-leaning factions within the Labor Party, that they need to appeal to this demographic of people that are, and it's more and more becoming the middle ground. It's not so much right-wing anymore. It's just basic common sense, reasonably thinking Australians that are seeing the ridiculousness and the folly really in these sorts of measures, especially around issues of gender and sexual orientation, that are conflicting with basic institutions and education and things like that. So I think it is an opportunity for the Conservative side of politics to lean into that and to be attractive to middle Australia rather than appealing to a left-wing Australia, which it's not anymore.
So, Michelle, from a little glimmer of light that might be happening on the ground in the Northern Territory and a change of government, some promises to repeal some bad laws, let's talk about another pretty serious issue that has developed with the Tickle and Giggle case. And, of course, Tickle and Giggle sounds like a lot of fun, doesn't it? But I guess when you think of the outcome here, and this is actually quite shocking, and particularly for half the population who are women, the word woman basically now meaningless. Give us your impression as to what's happened with the Tickle and Giggle case.
Yeah, well, just to give a bit of context, so a lady named Sal Grover, and I know Sal, she's a great lady, and she set up an app called the Giggle app as a social media site for women, as a digital women's only safe space, just for women. And she set up this AI system to detect from facial recognition digital photos that were uploaded by applicants, whether they were male or female. So the applicant's photo, the one who's made the case, was initially flagged as female, but upon further review, it showed that this person was actually a male, and they were excluded from the app. They were actually a transgender woman. And so the applicant then sued Giggle and Sal Grover for unlawful discrimination under the Sex Discrimination Act. So she was sued under the part in the Sex Discrimination Act, which is about gender identity. And so the applicant actually claimed gender identity discrimination in relation to the provision of services. So the fact that she wasn't allowed onto the app. And Sal Grover, of course, argued that, yes, of course, the app is discriminatory. It's meant to be just for women and for all women and even men out there. Acknowledge the fact that we do want only single-sex spaces at some times, especially when it comes to bathrooms and change rooms and women's only gyms or men's only facilities. And so the law does actually allow for this type of discrimination. But what's quite outstanding about this case is that the judge made this case about sex rather than gender identity. So when it comes to gender identity, the law would be applied in a situation where perhaps a transgender person was denied employment or denied services in areas where gender identity was irrelevant. But in this case, in the Giggle app, which was restricted to biological women, being transgender is very relevant in this. But the judge, instead of making this an issue about gender identity, which wouldn't fall within that category of non-discrimination, made this about sex. And so the claimant was able to claim indirect discrimination because the claimant was judged to be unreasonably discriminated against because they were transgender.
It is so serious. When we're talking about the federal court, we're talking about a very high-level court judgment here. And the judge deciding that sex is not confined to being a biological concept and referring to whether a person at birth had male or female physical traits. In fact, the federal court effectively revising how being a woman is interpreted. It makes it all the much more difficult, doesn't it, to actually have some common sense, biological, theological interpretation of what a woman is. How do you see that, Michelle?
That's right. Well, what this means is that men pretending to be women can access women's spaces anytime and anywhere. And because that's what the precedent that has been set here. And we know we live in a world where, there's women that have experienced trauma at the hand of men. They've experienced sexual abuse or domestic violence, and women at times seek refuge from men for their own healing. But a legal precedent has been set here that biology doesn't matter to sex, and that's huge. Not only for Christians, not only for vulnerable women, but really for the whole of our society. So we're really praying and hoping that this will be appealed and that it will be turned over.
So the judgment means, just come down to the nitty-gritty here. Every woman listening, every family, every father and mother listening, and they've got daughters, women's only spaces, now no longer able at all to resist or reject that person who could be a biological male. So we're talking about DV shelters, school change rooms, toilets, online chat rooms, prisons. There's a huge way that this is going to have an impact on women everywhere, isn't there?
That's exactly right. And we're even seeing there was recommendations by the Australian Building Codes Board that they're looking into bathrooms in public buildings. So this has just gone too far, and for the sake of the safety of our children, when you think of our daughters and even sending them off to the girls' toilets by themselves, no way will I be doing that if it goes this way. It's actually progressed this way in England, and they've had to pull it back because of certain cases of abuse within women's only spaces. And so we hope that as a nation we don't go that far before there's cases of where women have been abused by men in women's only spaces because they're allowed to under their gender identity. And we can just have a bit of common sense here, and common sense that really leads to the protection of women and children in women and female only spaces.
Now, I don't know, and I'm not sure even whether it's a right thing to ask you, if there might even be some case of judicial activism here coming from the judge who's made the decision. And, of course, you always tread carefully and assuming that our courts are places that are interpreting the law in a correct way. But I imagine here that there's, the Sex Discrimination Act, and this is not to do with the judiciary, this is to do with politicians who make the laws. This is where the challenge is in helping politicians understand that this is what Christians think is true and right, and somehow or other bringing about change politically. Is that the way that works?
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, the way that the judge has interpreted the law in this case, we believe, isn't true to the intent of the SDA. And so there needs to be further clarity within the SDA and some better sort of explanations as to what these phrases mean and what their intent is to protect. And so there aren't cases like this. And so, yes, we'll be lobbying the politicians on this and definitely considering ways that there can be a bit of judicial activism and holding this judge to account for misinterpreting the law in a way that has such big consequence upon our society.
And when things like this change, so hard to bring back a sense of common sense and truth in the whole process. But the challenge here is to amend the Sex Discrimination Act to protect female-born people, or women, as they used to be known. That's a challenge in itself. So now there's a battle that's going to be happening there. Is there any, I guess, will we watch this space, some initiatives from the ACL?
Yeah, I think we're at the moment we're uncovering how sexual orientation its way within the Sex Discrimination Act, the influence of activists to enhance that right at the expense of other rights. On the religious freedom issue, we're just holding on to those exemptions at the moment, but once they're gone, Christian institutions all over Australia are vulnerable to sexual orientation and gender identity being treated as an inherent characteristic or a protected attribute, and it's fundamentally at odds with our Christian theology of we're made male and female in the image of God. We believe marriage is between men. So at the moment that those exemptions are gone, which the Labor Party have said that they're going to do, we're vulnerable for anything that we do. It doesn't allow. Yes, so carry on.
So, I mean, the Christian position is absolutely clear God created male and female. A marriage is between a man and a woman. And when you start to upset that, this is what happens. And all of a sudden, women are no more. That's a really, really big challenge. Plenty more to say about that. We might have to save it for another day. Let's go through some things very quickly here. The issues in Queensland, the babies born alive issue, the Catters bill, that didn't have a great outcome last week either, did it?
Well, it went inquiry stage, and testimony at this inquiry of a midwife that had actually got into contact with ACL about 6 months ago, Rob Norman, and she told her story of babies that she's held that had survived abortions and had died in her arms. It's just absolutely tragic. This testimony actually made its way. The Australian picked it up, papers around the nation. Senator Ralph Babet heard of it as well, and as a result of the revelations, he introduced a motion into the Senate which called for that there are babies who survive abortions that should be treated with dignity and care and afforded the same rights as any newborn baby. And 18 senators of good sense voted in support of this urgency motion, but 32 actually voted against. And the only way I can understand that is they either don't understand the weight and the gravity of what Senator Babet had told them. Perhaps they don't believe it, or they actually do agree that babies that survive abortions should be left to die with no medical care. It's absolutely terrible to understanding.
It's tragic. In fact, one more quick issue. Let's turn our sights to Victoria, and as some are saying, the madness of Victoria's Games roundabout. It's a little bit like Commonwealth Games out, and a huge embarrassment, not only for Victoria, an embarrassment for Australia, but now this push for a gay games in Victoria. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah. I mean, we know the huge economic challenges that Victoria is facing at the moment, and that's the reason why they put off the Commonwealth Games. But now they're wanting to host the Gay Games, which will no doubt cost them an exorbitant amount of money, but in the name of LGBTQ rights. And the government just can't afford to be doing that at the moment. But it's unsurprising. We hoped that with the change of government from Dan Andrews to Jacinta Allen, that would see this stuff on the decline, not continue to be advocated from top levels. But she's let us down here, and we hope that they don't go down this route. It will be a huge waste of taxpayers' dollars.
And I'm sure the people at the Gay Games love the fact that we're even talking about it, because it gives it some level of publicity, because it's one of those things, isn't it? It's an ideologically driven attempt to just bring the whole gay agenda to the fore, and but certainly, if you're in Jacinta Allen's shoes, a difficult one, but she's going along with the gay agenda. Michelle Pearse, let me point people to the Australian Christian Lobby website. No doubt there'll be listeners, and maybe there are some who've heard our conversation today saying, I didn't know things were this bad, and there might be a little extra support by way of becoming a subscriber, or signing up to be a part of, a standing army of people to be a part of some of the processes of the Australian Christian Lobby. Well, the lobby website is acl.org.au. acl.org.au. Michelle Pearse is the CEO at the ACL. Michelle, thanks so much for great insight into these things that are happening today here in Australia. And some of those quite unbelievable, but they are happening. And thank you so much for your insights into those things today on 2020.
Thanks very much, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.